Greetings to everyone and welcome to the difficult case of the painter Emil Nolde. After the lecture, there will be time for Q&A. Please submit your questions. This is an event of our new monthly series, Flight or Fight, Story of Artists Under Repression, which is generously sponsored by Allianz Partners. I'm Rachel Stern, founding director and CEO of the Fritz Ascher Society for Persecuted, Ostracized, and Banned Art, based in New York. We discuss, publish, and exhibit artists that are not known to a larger public because they were suppressed by the German National Socialist regime between 1933 and 1945. Until today, many of these artists have not become part of larger art history. The case of the German expressionist Emil Nolde is different. Born in 1867, he was widely known and respected in 1933. In the following years, he became the most prominent victim of the Nazi art policies, and he is still seen as such. However, new research shows that he was also an ardent anti-Semite and a fanatical believer in Nazi politics. I'm excited to introduce Aya Soika, who was one of the first researchers allowed to study the compromising documents, which had been carefully hidden until recently. Aya Soika is professor of art history at Bard College in Berlin. She was born and raised in Berlin and gained a PhD from King's College, Cambridge. She has published widely in the field of German Expressionism and is author of the Catalogue Raisonné of Max Pechstein's oil paintings in 2011, the monograph Max Pechstein, The Rise and Fall of Expressionism with Bernhard Fulda in 2012, a book on the Brücke artists during the First World War in 2014, and one on Max and Lotte Pechstein's journey to the South Seas in 2016. Together with Bernhard Fulda and Christian Ring, she has curated the exhibition on Emil Nolde during the Nazi period at Berlin's National Gallery at Hamburger Bahnhof last year. And in parallel, together with Maike Hoffmann and Lisa Marai Schmidt, the show Die Brücke Artist during the Nazi period at the Brücke Museum Berlin. On the occasion of the two exhibitions, her research and that of the above mentioned colleagues was published in the accompanying catalogs. Welcome, Aya.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for your kind introduction. I should mention, perhaps right in the beginning, that you extended this invitation also to my husband and research partner, Bernhard Fulda, who teaches history at the University of Cambridge and who's been working on this project with me. He's not here today, but he's the one who actually conducted intensive archival work at the Nolde Foundation with support from the Humboldt and the Gerda Henkel Foundation. And in my case, Bard College Berlin granted me a sabbatical in the finishing stages of our project. The results of our research have been summed up so far in a number of articles in these two volumes as well, published on the occasion of the show at Berlin's National Gallery last year. And it is the exhibition that I would like to start with. The show was entitled Emil Nolde, a German legend, the artist during the Nazi period. It took place at Hamburger Bahnhof, a converted train station that is part of the National Gallery. It was curated by the two of us together with Christian Ring, the director of the Nolde Foundation. And also right in the beginning, I would like to acknowledge the Nolde Foundation's willingness in particular, not just because it was the conditio sine qua non for the realization of both exhibition and research, but also because of the peculiar nature of our project. The perusal of Nolde's problematic past isn't exactly on the agenda of a foundation that sees itself as executioner of the artist's last will. Even more so, since we did not limit our questions to Nolde himself, but also looked at the institutional practices after Nolde's death in 1956. Up until today, the foundation has played a key role in shaping the public image of the artist. Nolde's work has been permanently presented in the artist's former residence that you can see here. The studio house with the picture gallery on the left has been open to visitors for well over half a century. The foundation is located near the Danish border, not far from the popular North Sea island Sylt, particularly appealing in summer when the garden is in full bloom. The foundation has been instrumental in helping with a great number of other exhibitions in the past, given that it is the caretaker of the paintings and watercolors in Nolde's estate. These posters here give you an idea of the amount of Nolde shows organized in the last 6 years alone. Shows in Frankfurt, Copenhagen, Stockholm, Vienna, Edinburgh, Berlin, Leipzig, Hamburg, and other German cities. The point I'm trying to make with this compilation is that Nolde has been frequently on display. And if there is such a thing as a typical Nolde show, I would say that it is very much focused on Nolde's extraordinary use of colors and his pioneering role within the development of German Expressionism. Subtitles read, "Color is life, the splendor of color," or "in radiance in color." In that respect, Nolde represents the idea of an autonomous modern artist. The works speak for themselves. They are often presented in a white cube space which signals to beholders that they are to be separated from any social or political considerations. I'd like to use this collage in order to stress the contrast with our Berlin exhibition last year. Although the graphic designers of our Nolde show, here the poster at a Berlin tram stop, were also attracted by Nolde's powerful colorism and used a detail from a late 1930s watercolor for their design, our exhibition was different from previous Nolde shows in many respects. Above all, because it focused on the construction of what could be called the Nolde myth. We were trying to show, for example, how Nolde was very keen to shape his public image and to write himself into art history by having his letters and his autobiography published and by trying to monitor closely what was written about him. In order to emphasize the dynamics between artist, work, and public reception, we presented artworks together with photos and documentary materials. In each section, visitors would find plenty of so-called flatware, Flachware, in glass cases, letters, books, newspaper clippings, and so forth, displayed together with approximately 100 artworks, mostly watercolors and paintings. Drawing a connection between word and image, and thereby putting the images into new contexts, was one of our key aims. We also experimented with new formats, some of them rather unusual, perhaps even a no-go in a traditional modern art museum. For instance, we created color reconstructions to visualize the voids in Nolde's pictorial oeuvre, reimagining works which were lost, but which no doubt might affect our notion of Nolde's art today, if they still existed. Here on the left, you see two such color reconstructions, missing works entitled Vikings and Nordic People, works destroyed in May 1945, that probably were adaptations of these two watercolors on the right. They illustrate Nolde's self-understanding as a Germanic, in inverted commas, painter, as someone who felt strongly that his pictorial agenda was misunderstood by the regime, that he was mistakenly labeled degenerate. We also experimented with the reconstruction of Nolde's own picture gallery, the real space that is part of the Nolde Museum today. By reconstructing a former hanging of 1942 in our exhibition, we tried to introduce a slightly different Nolde. This iconic space, here a picture at the Nolde Foundation, what it really looks like in Zeebrugge, was initiated by the artist in the late 1930s and today features many of his expressionist works, mostly figure paintings. What we wanted to show in our exhibition was the artist as curator of his own work during the Nazi period. This reconstruction became possible thanks to a young German soldier who visited Nolde for a week in January 1942 and made various sketches of the room, just as he noted down everything else he saw. And here on the bottom left, you can see a self-portrait of that soldier, an art teacher who was named Dieter Holy and who died 2 years later in battle in Normandy. He was one of around 40 men, most of them stationed at the Eastern Front, who received regular letters from the Noldes. And just like many others, the Noldes noticed that he stopped writing back at some point, and they found out that he actually had died. So based on his detailed sketches, we asked, what kinds of works did Nolde choose for this private display, and how does his selection of the year 1942 differ from our Nolde canon today? What we noticed was that landscapes prevailed, but also pictures of peasants or medieval war veterans, also some lesser known works such as you can see on the right, the titles Holy Sacrifice, Heiliges Opfer, and Holy Fire of the year 1940. To conclude this introduction, I want to talk about the show's unexpected success. Planned as something that was rather experimental in character, it drew 150,000 visitors, far too many for the relatively small space in which it took place. Here a photograph taken from the balcony of Hamburger Bahnhof with the queues in the courtyard just a few days after the opening. Our show also received a lot of press attention, some of it rather unusual, not just detailed coverage in even the New York Times and Le Monde, but also in the biggest German tabloid, Bild, not exactly known for its feuilleton, recommending that a visit of the show should be nearly obligatory to all school children. I mention this kind of public impact for 3 reasons. Firstly, of course, because as academics, we're not used to this kind of wide dissemination of our research. Secondly, it illustrates how topics related to National Socialism, the Nazi period, are still of great interest to the German public sphere. And last and not least, it highlights the prominence that Emil Nolde still plays in German 20th century art. Many, even those who know little about art otherwise, might have come across his name. I want to stress this last factor, assuming that many participants in this event today may not necessarily be aware of Nolde's national popularity. So after this introduction to our show and the research project, let me come to what I called the difficult case of Emil Nolde. Nolde is known as an expressionist whose art was prominently displayed in the Degenerate Art exhibition of 1937. As you can see on these 2 pictures of the show's stop in Berlin in early 1938, with Nolde paintings, and on the lower picture with Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, visiting the show. At the same time, however, Nolde remained a loyal supporter of Nazi politics, repeatedly stressing his party membership and his belief in its larger goals. Together with his wife, Ada, he was also an eager recipient of the Nazis' anti-Semitic propaganda as transmitted through radio speeches and in their local paper. Even if the extent of Nolde's sympathies may have been unknown to scholars and public alike, his and his wife's political determination were something that his artist colleagues gossiped about. Quite a few of them had heard through the grapevine that Nolde had denounced Max Pechstein as a Jew in summer 1933 in front of an official of the propaganda ministry, causing his former Brücke colleague unpleasant problems. The Prussian Academy of Arts had to mediate and explain to Nolde that it, quotes, knows for certain that Max Pechstein is of purely Aryan origin. And that was in 1933, long time before other artists had to submit their Aryan ancestry to the Reich Chamber and other institutions. Perhaps not so surprising that the Berlin-based art critic Adolf Behne described Nolde after the war on the occasion of the artist's 80th birthday as a degenerate, als ein entarteter Entarteter. His poisoned appraisal stood in contrast with the many honors Nolde received at the time. And as you can imagine, Nolde was upset about Behne's article. Behne died a year later, and to cut a long story short, Nolde's Nazi past was increasingly suppressed, ignored, or forgotten. Nolde was exhibited frequently as one of the pioneers of Expressionism, as one of the most prominent representatives of those artists who had been persecuted during the Nazi period. And I included this photograph, which I very much like. It shows a shop window full of Nolde books and posters taken on the occasion of a Nolde show in Hanover in 1961, because I think it illustrates the veneration of his art at that time very well. So in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, German art historians and curators were eager to integrate the history of German modernism into a more European history of art. These two books by Werner Haftmann were instrumental, but also the many exhibitions which featured Nolde and often stressed his former persecution under the Nazis. Mentioning his anti-Semitic remarks or his loyal support of Adolf Hitler would have complicated an otherwise stringent narrative. Nevertheless, I do want to mention that in the course of the 1980s and 90s, this uncritical celebration started to get a bit more nuanced, with new articles being published on the subject and with exhibition catalogues addressing Nolde's party membership, as, for example, the Nolde retrospective in London in 1995. A review of The Independent summed up Nolde's contradictory nature. Dancing to fascism's tune, expressionist Nazi, Dane, German, watercolorist, and oil painter, Emil Nolde managed to be all of these things, but was he also just plain stupid? So even even decades before our show, the debate around Nolde's Nazi past was discussed in public. Another milestone was the retrospective that took place at Frankfurt at the Stede in 2014, curated by Felix Kremer, to which we contributed a catalogue essay. Many of the show's reviews alluded to the myth of Nolde's victimhood. Just giving you two examples here, Emil Nolde and the fairy tale of the victim, or another title on the right, Victim, Perpetrator, or Both. So what I'm trying to say is that knowledge about Nolde having been a Nazi sympathizer has been in the public domain for quite a long time. In fact, you could also know about his anti-Semitism just by going back to his autobiography. This book on the very right, published in 1934, was entitled Jahre der Kämpfe, Years of Struggle. Colleagues at the time pointed out the similarity of the title to Hitler's political biography, Mein Kampf, My Struggle. This is not implausible given Nolde's admiration of Hitler and his attempts to position himself when he was finishing the book in 1934. So his memoirs were always available, not just in the modified version that was edited by the Nolde Foundation after Nolde's death, which omitted some anti-Semitic passages, not all, but also in its original first edition. The dynamics of how the West German public has dealt with Nolde's Nazi past is fascinating. It mirrors developments in Germany's history of coming to terms with the Nazi period, as this beautiful word Vergangenheitsbewältigung. In the late 1990s, the director of the National Gallery, Peter Klaus Schuster, observed that the persecution experienced during the Nazi dictatorship saved many German modernists, not just Nolde, and I quote, from the disgrace and the almost irredeemable stigma of making common cause with the National Socialists. In retrospect, so his argument goes, Nolde and others were lucky to have been persecuted and to have been prominently included in the Degenerate Art campaign. It made it easier to forget about their willingness to serve the new regime. We can add that Nolde's art was suited to serve as opposite of our cliché of official Nazi art, and as such represented an aesthetic that was perceived as resistant. I'll come to that in a minute. So let me now present a very specific facet, and kind of a number of facets actually, which were central to previous readings of Emil Nolde during the Nazi period, readings which we have attempted to revise. They were essential for establishing Nolde's victimhood. First, Nolde, the degenerate artist. Nolde's works were key within the degenerate art shows. No other artist had so many works confiscated from public collections during the confiscation campaign, over 1,000 works. No other was so prominently displayed in the Degenerate Art exhibition in Munich. This is a visually forceful argument also because of the many photos that we still have of the propaganda show. Second, Nolde's myth of the Malverbot translated as a ban on painting. In the post-war period, up until very recently, Nolde's professional ban, which he did receive in summer 1941, was turned into an even more dramatic Malverbot, ban on painting. Third, the fact that Nolde continued to pursue his artistic practice despite the alleged ban on painting, this was stylized as an act of resistance, visually documented and illustrated by his unpainted pictures, over 1,000 small watercolors, which were said to have been painted in secrecy during the time of his persecution. Let me elaborate these 3 points by starting with the so-called unpainted pictures, the ungemalte Bilder. The claim that they were painted in secrecy during the Nazi period was a crucial factor in their reception as being resistant in themselves. Nolde's own biographical account described how he had created them in hiding, and this narrative was taken up by the art historian Bernhard Haftmann in his highly influential Nolde monograph. In our exhibition, we presented Haftmann's selection of Nolde's unpainted pictures of his book from 1963 in order to highlight the posthumous construction of a corpus of works which was held together by a post-war narrative, a narrative that stresses the artist's victimhood and resistance. What we see in his book is not just a careful selection of works, but also of artists' quotes by Nolde that accompanied the watercolors. Haftmann's interpretation, as commonly accepted up until recently, needs to be examined critically. In fact, many of these small watercolors were created way before the second half of the 1930s, and many of them were executed in oil afterwards, so cannot really claim their status as being unpainted sketches, as the term implies. In addition to that, if we look at Nolde's landscapes of the late 1930s, early 40s, one could argue that some of them can also be read in other ways. After all, Nolde himself considered his works to be a valid alternative to official Nazi painting. He interpreted his oeuvre as pure German art and asked earlier on for a distinction between German art and French art, as well as German art and Jewish art. His landscapes with fires and castles, as you can see here, lend themselves to an interpretation that is far from the narrative of the autonomous resistant artwork. For example, his quasi-religious title on the left, Holy Sacrifice, Heiliges Opfer, of the year 1940, created after the German invasion of France. Or on the right, his watercolor, Burning Castle, the oil version of it, which is lost, hung in Hermann Göring's castle near Salzburg, taken there by Göring's niece, who was a collector of Nolde and one of his supporters actually during the Second World War. reading his watercolors as politically resistant stands in conflict with what we know about Nolde's efforts to establish himself also in the Third Reich and with his ideological convictions. Last but not least, the claim that the unpainted pictures had to remain unpainted because Nolde was forbidden to paint is problematic, because he wasn't really. Making such a claim leads to wrong assumptions about his situation during the Third Reich. So I come to the Malverbot, the painting ban. The story of the artist who was forbidden to paint became one of the most effective narratives in 20th century German art, initially outlined in Nolde's own biography, the 4th volume that was published after his death. Nolde's own version was adapted and elaborated further by German writer Siegfried Lenz in his best-selling novel, The German Lesson of 1968. The book has been on the German National School curriculum for a long time. It has been made into 2 films, one only launched last year. The novel by Lenz has forcefully influenced the public's understanding of Nolde's persecution. The painter in the book, here stills from the new film, was so closely modeled on the Nolde myth that it was all too easy to identify the book's protagonist Nansen with Emil Nolde, who was born as Emil Hansen. Hansen, that is Nolde, becomes Nansen, an artist who stands up against the regime through his art. The 2 myths, the alleged ban on painting and that surrounding the origin of his unpainted pictures, the small watercolors, together with a focus on Nolde's persecution as a degenerate artist, are central to how Nolde's situation as a suppressed artist has been described in the post-war years. So let me now come back to Nolde, the degenerate artist. It is true, no other artist had so many works, over 1,000, confiscated from public collections in the year 1937. No other was presented as prominently in the Degenerate Art show, here a compilation of his works in this traveling exhibition. And yet, I would like to propose that boiling Nolde's situation down to him being defamed overlooks some decisive factors. For example, nearly half of the confiscated works were only purchased in 1935, 2 years after Hitler's rise to power, already during the Third Reich, and with permission of the newly appointed Essen Museum Director, Klaus Graf von Baudissin, who was ironically 2 years later involved in the Degenerate Art confiscation campaign. This indicates that the question of Nolde's degeneracy was far from clear in 1935. Arguably, no other modernist was so controversial in inner party debates as Nolde. Some officials were trying to promote him as a state painter, and quite a few considered him a suitable representative to the new art of the new regime. Related to this is the fact that Nolde successfully managed to have his works removed from the Degenerate Art show at the end of 1938. In fall 1940, Nolde was still hopeful that a change of policy towards his works would come about, and he sent a letter addressed to Hitler personally, without success. Talking about Nolde's hopes, achievements, and failures, and of his attempts to navigate through the Third Reich, we also have to take a closer look at his professional ban of 1941. As I already stated, Nolde was allowed to continue painting throughout the Nazi period, and so he did. He was not, however, allowed to exhibit, publish, or sell works that had not previously been approved of. Of course, this professional ban was a severe measure of oppression, but Nolde was aware that he was allowed to paint in private. So coming back to Siegfried Lenz and the German lesson, when the artist in the book receives his letter from the Reich Chamber of Fine Arts, he rhetorically asks whether the painting ban will be followed by a ban on eating and on drinking. Berufsverbot, Essverbot, Trinkverbot. This does not at all correspond to Nolde's personal situation at the time. In Nolde's case, it's also interesting to ask how his professional ban came about. As Bernhard Fulda could show, the ban was the result of Nolde's enormous success. In Nolde's tax declaration for the year 1940, he listed an income of almost 80,000 Reichsmark, a huge sum when compared with the average worker's annual income of roughly 2,000 marks. This was brought to the attention of Nazi officials and resulted in the issuing of the professional ban. After all, how could the regime tolerate a degenerate to be one of the top earners of the Reich? Despite of this, Nolde did not give up hope that he, a pioneering figure in the renewal of a true German art, as he was convinced, would finally be recognized, possibly after the successful end of the Second World War. We don't have time to go into his impressive network of connections, but many of his supporters encouraged him not to lose hope and to keep on fighting. The fight constitutes a leitmotif in his artistic career and also during the Nazi period. Just to give you an idea of Nolde's contacts, he was guest in Heinrich Himmler's house in November 1933. He had good contacts to Goebbels' personal assistant, was praised by the Minister of Education Bernhard Rust, later on found in Hermann Göring's niece and her husband Rudolf Diehl's loyal supporters, and stayed in touch with many others who had connections into the inner circles of the Reich. In the end, the main reason for his rejection was, we believe, the personal dislike of Adolf Hitler, who could not be convinced, even though the Noldes tried hard. In summer 1933, the Nazi foreign press officer Putzi Handstengel, photo on the top left, a Harvard graduate, staged a special display of Nolde in his Munich apartment and invited Hitler to lunch underneath 2 Nolde loans, which had been brought to his apartment all the way from Berlin with the help of Putzi Handstengel's sister and the employees of the National Gallery, and of course, Ada and Emil Nolde. Hitler didn't comment, which was taken by them as a good sign, but we know today, in retrospect, that he did rage against Nolde at another occasion later that year. And of course, that little collage is my creative contribution to this paper. We don't have a visual record of this. Okay, anti-Semitism. Before coming to my conclusion, I want to say at least a few words about Nolde's anti-Semitism. It has been argued that his anti-Semitic comments, for example, in a letter to Goebbels, were opportunistic and strategic, written because Nolde was trying to get his confiscated paintings back. However, looking at his correspondence with his wife and other personal friends, it can be stated that he firmly believed in his claims. In his autobiography, Years of Struggle, Nolde presents himself as a pioneer in a battle against an allegedly Jewish-dominated art scene. In 1933, Nolde developed a resettlement plan for Germany's Jewish population, a plan that he wanted to send to Hitler, but a well-meaning official from the education ministry discouraged him to do so. In 1943, Emil Nolde takes up ideas of the anti-Semitic propaganda that he listens to in speeches by Hitler and Goebbels via the radio, interpreting the war as the result of a Jewish world conspiracy. Nolde states in a note that the war, and I quote, was whipped up by a handful of smirking Jews safely hidden from view behind the great governments and banks of this world. He claimed, the dull, harmless masses have for the most part allowed themselves to become ensnared and are now fighting each other, friend and foe alike, all for the ideals of Jewish world domination. And he ended, if this insight ever becomes common knowledge, it will end the war. This was one of the private notes he sent to his wife in May 1943, who was in hospital at that time. Dealing with Nolde's anti-Semitism adequately would be a separate talk and requires more time, of course, so I'm afraid I really need to move on and come to my conclusion. What do we do with Emil Nolde? Given that this is a rather vague question, let me perhaps rather refer you to a question that was asked last April in newspapers. What do we do with the 2 Nolde paintings in Angela Merkel's office? Even before our exhibition opened, Merkel and her staff decided to take the 2 Nolde paintings, here's the other one on the top left, down, not just for our show, but for good. This was perceived by some as a premature and highly controversial move. It fueled a public debate about whether removing artworks was the way forward. Does this lead to a culture of cleansing? Does it threaten the freedom of art? This is a controversy that goes beyond the exhibition space and extends into the public and political sphere. A sphere that has embraced Nolde's art since the 1970s, starting with Chancellor Helmut Schmidt. It connects German Expressionist art with questions of national identity and the ongoing question of how to deal with the Nazi past. I believe that it has taken a while, longer than necessary, to sink in how Nolde's presentation as a victim, and a victim only, was one-sided wishful thinking of a generation that was in search of a good modernism. In the past decades, we have gained a more comprehensive and more complex idea of German art of the early 20th century. The lecture series of the Fritz Ascher Society, which looks at the work and life of suppressed artists, is one such example. And even though Nolde isn't really part of them, as I hope I could show, he allows to revisit our collective need to construct morally clear-cut heroes in the art world. Thank you for your attention. I end also with an installation view of our show with a picture from Merkel's office and bookshelves with different editions of Lenz's German lessons. Thank you, yeah, everybody, and it's a shame that we can't see you. We can't see you out there.
Thank you so much, Aya. This was a really fascinating and such a rich talk that it's hard to figure out where to start. But I'll start with questions because there are questions already. David Stern asked, wasn't Nolde admired by the National Socialist art students in the early 30s and hailed as a true German painter?
Yes, this is an important point. This is something I could only tackle very briefly. I described it as the inner party controversy. And really, there was no other artist, perhaps Ernst Barlach, yeah, and currently we have a Barlach retrospective in Dresden at the Albertinum. But Barlach died in 1938 and is still a very different case, but there was no other painter who was so controversial and so much fought for, especially by the young. And what you're referring to is the National Socialist student youth, and they were passionate about trying to promote a kind of new Nordic expressionism that could be a kind of equivalent to futurism in Mussolini's Italy, for example. Yeah, they thought the new movement and National Socialism was promoted as a movement rather than just a party. The new movement needed a new young art, and interestingly, Nolde always felt that he was part of this younger generation as well. And there were a number of younger idealists who were also Nazi idealists who were fighting for his art. So I also only mentioned briefly kind of the personal PA to Goebbels in the propaganda ministry. He is one of these young, passionate fighters for Nolde, who has the idea in 1933 to even make him an official state painter, to even give him the presidency of the newly created Reich Chamber of Fine Arts. Yeah, it does not happen, and this Hans Weidemann that then gets relocated to the film department. But this inner party controversy has often in scholarship been pinned down to the summer of 1933. And it's true that it takes a climax in these months. But in Nolde's case, this controversy continues all the way throughout the 1930s, well beyond 1937, well beyond the opening of the Munich Degenerate Art exhibition. And I think this is another reason why Nolde is so interesting, because he really makes us ask this counterfactual question: what if Hitler, I don't know, had been assassinated, and if somebody else of the Nazi party had taken over power, what would have happened to Nolde? Because he had very strong promoters within the very inner circles of the Nazi leadership.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Susan Schender asks, can you talk more about Holy Fire and Holy Sacrifice? Did you say they were done to show his support of the war? Why the titles?
It's a difficult question, because what in the exhibition and in our research, we have tried to work very, very closely with the sources and to avoid these kind of retrospective interpretations that were imposed upon lots of Nolde works. But it can be observed, and I think I have here later on a kind of image that I took out. Yeah, here you see the Holy Sacrifice, a kind of mystical scene. Sorry, this is just kind of zooming in on the sacrificial scene that reminded me, and here I become speculative, yeah, of a staging inauguration of the victims of the Hitler Putsch in 1923, and this monument that was built in Munich. But basically, I think what he's doing with some of these watercolors then later on is to try and come up with a mystic Nordic art that could well fit the ideal that these young students of the Nazi Student Union had in mind when they were trying to promote Nolde in the year 1933, when Hans Weidemann was trying to make him a state artist, when the propaganda ministry was trying to push him. Yeah, so I guess to juxtapose Haftmann's idea that his small watercolors are in themselves resistant because the artist was suppressed during the Nazi period is a premature conclusion. And I think we need to look very carefully and for instance, this little anti-Semitic note that I read out in the end, yeah, he sent that to his wife together with some of these small watercolors and one in the same envelope to the hospital. So there are suddenly connections that have not been made previously, and we'd like to bring them to the table. And I think it's an open discussion what we do with these works. They're also very little known, I must say, been hardly exhibited as well.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, thank you. Luis Saldana asks, were the other Die Brücke members aware of Nolde's allegiance to the Nazi party? Were the others involved in any way? And that kind of ties in, I know at the same time, there was this exhibition, with this exhibition was an exhibition that you were also involved in at the Brücke Museum about the, really the Nazi past of the Brücke artists. You Could you elaborate a little bit about that?
Absolutely. I mean, that might go, perhaps this is a good opportunity to also to invite the co-curator of the show at the Brücke Museum, Maike Hoffmann, with whom I've been doing this together, also with Lisa Marei-Schmidt, the director of the Brücke Museum, when we dedicated that show to the fates of Max Pechstein, Erich Heckel, and Karl Schmidt-Rottluff. I think Nolde's situation was quite unique due to his excellent network and his ambition from early on to write himself into art history and to explain what he was doing in his autobiography, and by doing that to also position himself very explicitly. That is not the case with the other Brücke artists. Well, kind of, since the question is in how far they were aware and how they related to that, Nolde and the Brücke was a rather loose connection. He joined the group late as a senior, he was invited, and then he quit the group early as well, and he was never part of that living cooperative of the communal drawing sessions, for example, in Dresden. And they had a very distanced relationship to Emil Nolde. I mean, I mentioned his denunciation of Max Pechstein in 1933, in summer 1933, and I think that must have come as a surprise to Pechstein himself. He tried to call him, and Nolde was kind of in denial on the phone and wasn't accommodating and did not have any sympathies to Pechstein's argument that kind of declaring him as a Jew to somebody at the propaganda ministry was existence threatening to the artist. Yeah, mm-hmm. And Pechstein, who was also very well connected among Berlin artists, soon spread the word about this incident. I think that was quite unheard of at the time. I think one can argue that Nolde was quite apart, and interestingly, he never felt to be in a common fight with the other artists who were labeled degenerate. There's a note, I think he writes in the early 40s, when he actually accepts the notion of degenerate art, when he outlines that around a third of the works in the Degenerate Art exhibition were in fact degenerate. Another third were sort of mediocre, and a third was good art. So he sort of accepts that notion, and his fight is directed at being removed out of the show, not being mentioned in the context of degenerate art anymore, and ultimately also being recognized as a pioneer of the renewal of German art, something that he tried to promote ever since the publication of his first and second volume of his autobiographies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's, connects us to the reception in 1945. Elizabeth Berkowitz asks, aside from Nolde and the preservation of his personal legacy, who were the beneficiaries of fostering and perpetuating the Nolde myth? What are the stakes of turning Nolde into an oppressed modern degenerate artist as opposed to the reality of who he was?
I think in order to respond to that very good question, apart from individual players like the founding director of the Nolde Foundation, who was also very emotionally attached to the Nolde couple, we are dealing here with a whole generation of people, of art historians and curators who have experienced the Nazi regime, who are still there in Germany. Yeah, these are people who were not forced into exile, most of the time, but those who stayed in Germany, who then actually come back to the canon of painters and artists that in a way they grew up with, and that they fought for. Yeah, many of, kind of, we early on during the Q&A, we referred to these students who were fighting for a Nordic German Expressionism. Interestingly, it's many of them and their network that pop up after the Second World War, and connect to the artists that they were trying to promote unsuccessfully in the early 1930s, when there was a very heated controversy over what constitutes German art. Yeah. Well before Hitler gained power, actually. So I think this is, so there are these actors, there is this network of people who continue to be there, and then after 1945, who also take up positions as museum directors and curators and art historians, writers, so forth. But I think there's more to your question, and I think that's got to do with a psychological need for a kind of good German modernism, yeah, within these efforts to integrate German Expressionism within European modernism. I think there was a general need to try and not look so closely at the individual fates, because this is something that happens also in other realms, not just the cultural realm, yeah, but also in politics and elsewhere. And it takes a long time. There are a couple of milestones on the way. I think the Auschwitz trials, for example, yeah, the Eichmann trial, and then Frankfurt, the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials, of course, as well. They changed public awareness. 1968 student revolution also changes the way that the past is thought about. But I think it's a very complex question. I think we're only just getting there, kind of trying to address it adequately.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There are very many very good questions. So we'll see how, I think we'll be able to get 2 or 3 in still. Michael Hoffman asked, how must we, and that ties in with your answer a little bit, how must we evaluate the attitude of the 2 former directors of the Nolde Museum in Cebu who prevented access to the archive? Because the documents there are not only important to better understand Emil Nolde, but to come to terms with the German past.
Michael, hello. I think we can talk about this in another time. It's true that, I mean, I think the founding director is a particularly interesting case, because he's the one who kind of who arrived also as a soldier, yeah, kind of just released from his duty at the Nolde's house, I think in 1945 even, Joachim von Lepel, and builds up the foundation. And then later on, I think they were very much trying to do the best in the interest of the artist. And I think kind of the way they have dealt with Nolde is very representative of the way that modernist art and modernist artists have been heroized for a long time, when it was considered to be damaging also to the art to dig deeper or to present details, biographical details perhaps, that did not fit kind of the smooth ideal of the modern artist. So I think it's also a question about how we do art history. Yeah, and I think decisive changes have happened universally in the 1980s when it comes to kind of breaking down artistic myths and looking more critically, approaching artists more critically with a different set of questions. I think it also very much depends on the set of questions and what kind of questions you ask.
And that was that actually very much ties into Stephanie Barron's question. She asked, is your sense that your research and exhibition is being embraced, not just by the public, but by museums, and how they may reframe their Nolde presentations?
We've had that discussion in last year intensively, I think, and I talked to a lot of curators also about how to deal with Nolde. It's a tricky question, but I think that question too relates to how we deal with the holdings in our museums, how we critically reflect upon what works ended up in institutions. I mean, here with the Fritz Ascher Society, we're kind of looking at artists who were not canonized, who were not collected. I think the German Historical Museum at the moment is making a point in purchasing additional works by Felix Nussbaum, an artist who was killed in the Holocaust, an artist who was marginalized for a long time, whose work has been reappraised, and we have a Nussbaum museum built by Daniel Liebeskind in Osnabrück. But I think this ties into the reassessment of what museums stand for today, how we deal with collections, how we contextualize what we have in the holdings, and it extends far beyond Nolde. And for me as an art historian, as a teacher as well, it's an exciting time because it's wonderful to debate these questions with students, but I think as a curator, it's probably more challenging.
Last question is really about how much the artist and his political convictions are connected. Their question, it's being questioned, should Nolde now be taken out of museums? Or another question from Franklin Mount. He asked, do you believe that Nolde's politics are reflected in his non-political paintings? Meaning, do we condemn Nolde's art because of his political views and convictions, or do the paintings really show his political convictions? Is that in them, other than this Nordic myth about which you spoke?
I think again that's a question that probably can only be responded to also subjectively, because we've had lots of, we really had the full range of responses about how to deal with Nolde from now on. I mean, let's take a painting like here, the seascape that used to be in Angela Merkel's office. Well, do I have a better picture? Here you can see it. Unpolitical, right? But at the same time, kind of having done our research on Nolde, of course, it resonates. Sort of Caspar David Friedrich, there's a romantic tradition, kind of this is how the Nordic expressionists were put within a lineage of German art. At the time, it was done in 1936. It was actually exhibited at Nolde solo exhibitions after 1933 several times in a private Berlin gallery. But of course, it's not, it's devoid of any ideological symbols. So I think that you can make a point for leaving it where it was in the Chancellor's office. At the same time, I can understand if an official kind of guest from a different state, perhaps a state that has suffered very much under the Germans, comes to visit and feels differently about it. So I think there can be no universal response to that question. But what I want to stress is that I'm all for making the sources accessible, for encouraging the beholder to find out for him or herself, not to having to do without stuff because that stuff is not considered appropriate, and thereby perhaps also reflecting more critically about how we see pictures, how we interpret pictures, and what we kind of then make of it, kind of with the help of these different sources. And there's a lot that is, kind of the narrative framework, the invisible narrative framework that goes into the interpretation of each single work is enormous. And of course, it always differs depending on what set of questions you bring.
What a beautiful conclusion. Thank you so much, Aya, for your thought-provoking talk. We will post the recording of this event in the event link on our website, so you can revisit this talk. In the next event on September 16 at 5 p.m., German TV producer Sabine Rollberg will speak about Dance Under the Swastika, Mary Wigman and Gib Schlicht. A fascinating talk about her famous mother and her teacher, the founder of German Expressive Dance. Please stay in touch with us, stay well, and stay strong. All the best.
And thank you for all your excellent questions. It was a pleasure to do this from my desk at home. be in New York City and in spirit.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
Bye, thank you.